Power doesn't need violence to control a room. Sometimes humiliation is enough. For years, one woman ruled through fear disguised as leadership. The room obeyed without question. Until two boys with no status, no voice, and no protection noticed something the room never had. Fear only works when everyone agrees to feel it. Margaret Hale did not need permission to dominate a room. Her authority announced itself before she spoke, carried in the way people straightened their posture when she arrived, in how conversations paused just long enough to recalibrate. She was a powerful American woman whose reputation had been built on decisiveness, confidence, and an unshakable belief in her own judgment. In professional and social spaces alike, she was known as someone who set the tone and expected others to follow it without question. The room reflected her influence. It was carefully arranged, polished, and functional, designed for performance rather than comfort. Chairs were aligned with precision, lighting softened but deliberate, the kind of environment that made people hyper, aware of how they appeared and where they stood. Margaret occupied the center of this space naturally, as if it had been constructed with her presence in mind. No one challenged that assumption. They adjusted to it. Her control was not loud or aggressive. It was measured, practiced, and deeply intentional. Margaret understood the power of tone more than volume, of timing more than force. She did not interrupt often, but when she did, the interruption carried weight. She did not raise her voice, but her words landed with enough sharpness to linger. Humiliation, when it occurred, was precise and public, delivered just subtly enough to avoid open confrontation while leaving no doubt about hierarchy. This was not accidental behavior. Margaret used humiliation as a tool, not a lapse in decorum. It was how she reinforced boundaries without appearing unprofessional. By exposing small mistakes, questioning competence in front of others, or highlighting perceived weaknesses, she reminded the room who held authority. The discomfort it caused was part of the design. People learned quickly that being singled out was costly, and that silence was safer than resistance. Over time, the room adapted. People chose their words carefully. They avoided eye contact when scrutiny passed their direction. They laughed at remarks that were not funny and nodded at decisions they did not fully support. The environment rewarded compliance and punished hesitation. What might have once felt like confidence hardened into entitlement, but the distinction blurred in spaces where outcomes mattered more than process. Margaret's presence created a quiet choreography. People shifted in their seats when she leaned forward. They grew still when she paused. The smallest gestures carried meaning. A raised eyebrow, a prolonged silence, a measured glance across the table. None of it required explanation. The room had learned the language, and fluency was a form of survival. The emotional hook lay in how easily authority transformed into something unquestioned. Margaret did not demand respect explicitly. She assumed it. That assumption went unchallenged because it was reinforced by results. Projects succeeded. Decisions moved forward. Efficiency became the justification for behavior that might otherwise have been scrutinized. In this room, effectiveness excused excess, yet beneath the surface, discomfort settled in. It was not dramatic or immediate. It appeared as hesitation before speaking, as relief when attention moved elsewhere. People sensed that something about the balance of power was off, but lacked the framework to articulate it. The room functioned too well to invite critique. Questioning Margaret felt not only risky but irrational. Cinematically, the space felt contained, almost sealed. The walls absorbed tension without releasing it. The air carried a density that made time feel slower. Each moment stretched just enough to heighten awareness. The room did not erupt or collapse, it endured. That endurance was mistaken for stability. Margaret thrived in this environment because it mirrored her worldview. Control equaled order. Order equaled success. She believed that discomfort was a necessary byproduct of leadership, a small price to pay for results. Apologies, in her mind, weakened authority. Acknowledging harm implied doubt, and doubt threatened efficiency. So she never apologized. She moved forward, confident that progress justified method. The people around her internalized this logic. They rationalized their silence as professionalism. They told themselves that intent mattered more than impact, that Margaret's behavior was simply part of high-stakes environments. Over time, this reasoning became automatic. The room learned not to flinch. What made the dynamic particularly powerful was its predictability. Everyone knew what would happen if someone pushed back, not because it had happened often, but because the threat was implicit. Humiliation did not need to be frequent to be effective. Its possibility was enough. The room policed itself. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. The room produced outcomes. Meetings concluded on time. Decisions were clear. There was no chaos to point to, no obvious injustice. The discomfort was internal, diffuse, and easily dismissed. That invisibility allowed the imbalance to persist. Margaret stood as the unchallenged center of this system, unaware or unconcerned with the cost. To her, the room was functioning exactly as intended. She mistook silence for agreement, compliance for respect. The absence of resistance confirmed her belief that authority, once established, did not require maintenance. No one in that room believed anything could shift the balance of power. Margaret Hale's behavior did not become acceptable overnight. It was absorbed gradually, normalized through repetition, and reinforced by results. Each successful outcome strengthened the belief that her methods were effective, and effectiveness, in spaces like this, carried more weight than ethics. People did not ask whether her approach was right. They asked whether it worked, and by every measurable standard the room valued, it did. Success acted as insulation. Projects moved forward. Numbers improved. External recognition followed. These outcomes were cited whenever discomfort surfaced, quietly and privately. Margaret's sharpness was reframed as rigor. Her public corrections were labeled transparency. Her humiliations were recast as accountability. Language softened the edges of behavior that might otherwise have been questioned. Over time, the reframing became automatic. Public humiliation, in particular, was justified as leadership. It was said to build resilience, to prepare people for pressure, to separate those who could perform from those who could not. The room absorbed this narrative because it offered safety. If humiliation was leadership, then enduring it became professionalism. People learned to accept moments of embarrassment as part of growth, even when those moments felt excessive or unnecessary. Fear played a quiet but central role in this transformation. It did not manifest as panic or threat. It appeared as calculation. People weighed the cost of speaking against the benefit of silence. They considered careers, reputations, and future opportunities. In that calculus, dignity often lost. Silence felt strategic. Compliance felt rational. Resistance did not disappear because people agreed with Margaret. It disappeared because resistance demanded exposure. Speaking up meant standing alone, without assurance of support. The room offered no protection for dissent. Those who considered challenging Margaret quickly recognized the risks. They saw how others were treated when singled out, how credibility could be questioned with a single remark, how confidence could be undermined in moments. Fear did the rest. This fear reshaped behavior subtly. People stopped offering incomplete ideas. They waited until they were certain. They deferred more often. They chose neutrality over contribution. Meetings became efficient but shallow. The room produced decisions but not debate. What looked like alignment was often avoidance. The emotional cost of this shift was rarely acknowledged. People told themselves that discomfort was temporary, that they would adapt. Some convinced themselves that Margaret's intentions mattered more than her impact. Others focused on outcomes, telling themselves that personal feelings were irrelevant in high-performing environments. These justifications allowed them to remain without confronting the erosion of respect they felt. Choosing safety over dignity became habitual. It was not a dramatic choice, but a series of small ones. Laughing at remarks that felt inappropriate. Staying quiet when someone else was embarrassed. Avoiding eye contact during moments of tension. Each choice reinforced the culture, making the next one easier. Over time, the room forgot what open respect felt like. Speaking up felt costly because the consequences were unpredictable. Margaret did not punish dissent consistently. Sometimes she ignored it. Sometimes she responded with sharp critique. Sometimes she remembered it later, in unrelated contexts. This unpredictability amplified fear. When consequences are unclear, people imagine the worst. Silence becomes the safest option. The room developed an unspoken agreement. Survival depended on anticipation. People learned to read Margaret's moods, to anticipate her reactions, to adjust before correction was necessary. This hyper-awareness consumed energy, but it was preferable to exposure. Respect, once mutual, was replaced by vigilance. What made the culture particularly resilient was its plausibility. From the outside, the room appeared disciplined and effective. There were no obvious conflicts, no visible breakdowns. The tension remained internal, distributed across individuals who assumed they were alone in feeling it. That isolation prevented collective awareness. Each person believed the problem was personal, not structural. Margaret benefited from this fragmentation. Without collective resistance, her authority remained intact. She interpreted silence as endorsement, efficiency as satisfaction. The absence of challenge confirmed her belief that her leadership style was not only acceptable, but necessary. She did not see fear. She saw order. The room, in turn, internalized obedience. It was not obedience born of loyalty, but of adaptation. People learned what was expected and delivered it. Over time, the distinction between respect and fear blurred. Compliance looked like professionalism. Endurance looked like commitment. The culture sustained itself without requiring Margaret to assert control explicitly. Yet beneath this surface, something remained unresolved. The cost of silence accumulated quietly. People carried moments they could not forget, remarks that lingered longer than intended. The room functioned, but it did not heal. That unresolved tension waited for a disruption it could not anticipate. The room had learned obedience until two unnoticed figures entered it. The room Margaret Hale commanded existed far from the streets where consequences were immediate and unavoidable. It was insulated by glass, protocol, and distance, designed to protect decision-makers from the realities their decisions shaped. Beyond that insulation lay a neighborhood the room was never built for, a place that functioned according to a different logic, one defined less by authority and more by endurance. The neighborhood did not announce itself with crisis or spectacle. It revealed itself through continuity. Buildings bore the marks of long use and short repair. Sidewalks were uneven not from neglect alone, but from years of temporary fixes layered over unresolved problems. Public services existed, but just barely, stretched thin across needs that exceeded their capacity. This was not disorder. It was a system operating at its limits. Systemic poverty here was not a story of constant emergency. It was a pattern of constraint. Choices narrowed early. Time was spent managing access, transportation, schedules, resources, rather than exploring possibility. People became experts at prioritization because misjudgment carried immediate cost. The environment taught precision without promising reward. Survival required attention, not optimism. Perception was shaped accordingly. In this neighborhood, people learned to read context before content. They noticed shifts in routine because routine was fragile. They tracked reliability because reliability was rare. The absence of noise did not mean safety, and the presence of order did not guarantee fairness. Understanding these distinctions was not theoretical. It was practical knowledge refined daily. The distance between this world and Margaret's room was not measured only in miles. It was measured in assumptions. In the room, mistakes were corrected publicly but absorbed privately. In the neighborhood, mistakes lingered. In the room, authority shielded those who wielded it. In the neighborhood, authority passed through without stopping. The same systems that felt responsive in one space felt unreachable in the other. This distance shaped expectations. People here did not expect acknowledgement. They did not assume their experiences would translate into influence. The city spoke about places like this in reports and proposals, but rarely in conversations where decisions were made. Visibility existed without representation, presence without power. The emotional grounding of the neighborhood came from its realism. There were routines, responsibilities, and moments of quiet resilience that rarely made headlines. Children learned early how to navigate space, how to recognize which areas were watched and which were ignored. Adults balanced fatigue with obligation, maintaining stability through repetition. Nothing about the environment invited dramatization. It demanded adaptation. The room Margaret controlled would have struggled to interpret this world accurately. Its language favored metrics over memory, outcomes over observation. It evaluated success through distance from consequence. The neighborhood evaluated success through proximity to stability. These frameworks did not intersect. They spoke past each other, each convinced of its own coherence. What the room could not account for was how this environment trained attention. Without the distractions of curated spaces, people here experienced reality without filters. Patterns stood out because there was little to obscure them. Changes were noticed because consistency mattered. Observation was not a choice, it was a condition. The neighborhood did not produce cynicism, it produced caution. People learned not to assume intent where there was none, but also not to ignore repetition. They learned that systems rarely corrected themselves without pressure, and that pressure did not always come from those in charge. Sometimes it came from accumulation from memory held long enough to matter. This was a world where authority was not respected automatically. It was assessed. Reliability earned trust, inconsistency eroded it. Words carried less weight than outcomes. Promises were treated as provisional until proven otherwise. These lessons were not taught explicitly. They were absorbed through experience. The contrast between the room and the neighborhood was stark, but invisible to those who did not move between them. The room believed it understood the city because it reviewed summaries of it. The neighborhood understood the room only through its effects. Decisions that arrived without explanation and consequences that settled without acknowledgement. The gap between intention and impact widened quietly. Emotionally, the neighborhood carried a different kind of awareness. It did not expect fairness, but it recognized patterns of unfairness quickly. It did not anticipate intervention, but it noticed when intervention occurred selectively. This sensitivity was not paranoia. It was calibration. From this environment emerged individuals whose perspective did not align with the room's expectations. They did not see authority as inherently legitimate. They saw it as conditional, dependent on behavior rather than position. They were not impressed by confidence alone. They watched for consistency. The room, designed to reward certainty and suppress hesitation, could not imagine the value of this perspective. It assumed relevance flowed upward. That meaningful observation came from proximity to power. It did not consider that distance might sharpen vision. That assumption was its blind spot. The neighborhood did not prepare people to challenge rooms like Margaret's directly. It prepared them to endure, to notice, to remember. These skills were undervalued in spaces that prized performance. Yet they persisted, quietly, without needing validation. The emotional realism of this world lay in its restraint. There was no expectation of rescue, no narrative of sudden change. Life continued through adjustment rather than breakthrough. This realism fostered patience, a willingness to observe without demanding immediate resolution. That patience would matter later. From this world came two boys the room would never take seriously. Evan Brooks and Malik Turner did not grow up believing the world was fair, but neither did they believe it was hostile by default. Their understanding of reality formed somewhere in between, shaped by observation rather than explanation. They learned early that attention mattered more than assumption, and that seeing clearly often mattered more than being seen. This awareness did not arrive through lessons or warnings. It arrived through environment. Their upbringing emphasized awareness over innocence, not because innocence was denied to them, but because it was fragile. The neighborhood they moved through each day required reading context before reacting. Sounds carried meaning. Absences mattered. Patterns repeated until they became instructive. Evan and Malik learned to watch before acting, to listen before speaking. These habits were not framed as skills. They were simply necessary. They were not heroic figures waiting for a moment of courage. They did not imagine themselves as disruptors or challengers. They were observant, careful, and restrained. Evan noticed how routines shifted when unfamiliar people passed through. Malik remembered details others dismissed as irrelevant. Together, they processed their surroundings quietly, without commentary. Their strength was not boldness. It was consistency. Poverty did not grant them protection. It granted them time. Time spent waiting for transportation, waiting for doors to open, waiting for adults to finish responsibilities. That waiting created space for attention. In those spaces, Evan and Malik noticed what others overlooked. They saw how systems touched their lives indirectly, through decisions made elsewhere. They did not name these forces, but they recognized their effects. Invisibility shaped how they moved. Being overlooked meant they could exist without interruption. Adults rarely questioned their presence. Authority passed by without engaging them. This absence of scrutiny allowed them to observe freely. Invisibility became positioning. It placed them outside expectation, beyond the range of attention that might have altered their behavior. They were not performing. They were watching. Their emotional hook lay in this quiet positioning. They were present without being acknowledged, aware without being credited. The world did not ask them to contribute, and so it did not monitor their understanding. This freedom was subtle, but it mattered. It allowed them to form impressions unshaped by approval or fear of consequence. They did not need to impress anyone. They needed only to understand. When Evan and Malik entered the room Margaret Hale controlled, they did so without anticipation. The room was not meant for them. Its language, rhythm, and expectations were unfamiliar, but not intimidating. They approached it as they approached everything else, by observing first. They noticed the stillness, the tension, the way people adjusted themselves without instruction. They felt the weight of authority before they understood its source. They did not interpret the room emotionally. They interpreted it structurally. Who spoke and who did not. Where attention lingered and where it retreated. How discomfort moved across faces without being acknowledged. These details stood out to them, not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent. The room behaved like a system, and systems left patterns. Evan noticed the pauses. Malik noticed the reactions. Together, they recognized repetition. Humiliation followed certain triggers. Silence followed humiliation, the sequence repeated without deviation. No one challenged it. No one disrupted it. The predictability was striking. It suggested intention rather than accident. They did not react outwardly. There was no visible response, no change in posture or expression. Their awareness remained internal. They understood instinctively that attention did not require announcement. In fact, announcing it would have diminished its value. The room did not expect anything from them, and so it did not watch them closely. That assumption created opportunity. Their background had taught them that systems often revealed more through behavior than explanation. The room was no different. It communicated its rules through consequence, not instruction. Even and Malik absorbed those rules quickly. They saw how authority maintained itself through repetition and how silence reinforced it. They did not judge what they saw. They cataloged it. What made their presence consequential was not action but persistence. They continued to notice. They continued to remember. Each moment added to a growing internal record. The room's behavior did not change immediately, but their understanding of it deepened. They recognized how humiliation functioned not as correction, but as reinforcement. How fear replaced respect without being acknowledged. The boys' invisibility insulated them from the room's pressure. They were not participants in its hierarchy. They were observers of it. This distance allowed them to see what those inside could not. People embedded in the room were too close to question its structure. Avon and Malik, uninvested and unrecognized, saw it clearly. Their upbringing had prepared them for this role without naming it. They had learned that relevance was often assigned arbitrarily, and that being deemed irrelevant could be an advantage. The room's failure to take them seriously was not an oversight. It was a feature of how power assessed importance. That assessment would prove inaccurate. The stakes emerged quietly. What Evan and Malik noticed was not dramatic, but it was destabilizing. It suggested that the room's authority depended on compliance more than legitimacy, that its control was maintained through silence rather than agreement. These realizations did not provoke immediate action. They provoked restraint. They understood that knowledge carried responsibility even when unacknowledged. Holding that responsibility without guidance or protection was its own burden. Yet they did not retreat from it. They continued to observe, aware that understanding, once gained, could not be undone. Their role was not to confront, but to remain present long enough for patterns to reveal themselves fully. What they noticed inside that room would change how it functioned. Margaret Hale did not humiliate impulsively. Her actions followed a pattern refined over time, one that relied on precision rather than emotion. Each instance was calibrated to reinforce hierarchy without appearing excessive. The humiliation never looked dramatic enough to provoke open backlash, yet it was sharp enough to remind everyone in the room where authority resided. This balance was what allowed it to continue without consequence. Her method was simple in structure but complex in impact. She isolated individuals through attention, not aggression. A mistake, however minor, became a moment of instruction. A hesitation became evidence of inadequacy. These moments were delivered publicly, not to correct behavior, but to establish dominance. By choosing visibility, Margaret ensured the lesson extended beyond its immediate target. Everyone else learned it too. Humiliation functioned as psychological dominance because it attacked credibility rather than competence. Margaret did not accuse people of failing, she implied they were unreliable. This distinction mattered. Failure could be corrected, unreliability lingered. Once planted, doubt altered how others perceived the individual long after the moment passed. The room absorbed this shift silently, adjusting its internal rankings without needing instruction. The room's silence enabled repetition. Each time humiliation occurred without resistance, it validated the method. No one intervened. No one redirected the moment. The absence of response transformed behavior into norm. Over time, what might have once felt uncomfortable became expected. The room learned when to look away, when to remain still, when to signal alignment through subtle gestures. Silence became participation, emotional discomfort escalated gradually. It did not arrive as outrage or protest. It arrived as tension carried internally. People anticipated exposure before it happened. They rehearsed responses, refined explanations, avoided risk. The fear was not of failure itself, but of being publicly diminished. That fear narrowed expression. Creativity receded. Compliance expanded. Margaret's authority thrived in this environment because it removed the need for overt control. The room policed itself. People corrected one another preemptively, not out of loyalty, but out of caution. This self-regulation allowed Margaret to maintain dominance without frequent intervention. When she did act, the impact was magnified by rarity. Humiliation became an event, not a routine. No dialogue was required to sustain this system. Actions and reactions communicated everything. A prolonged pause signaled disappointment. A brief glance communicated dismissal. The room responded instantly, recalibrating posture and focus. These exchanges were subtle, efficient, and deeply ingrained. The absence of words made them harder to challenge. Nothing explicit had been said. There was nothing to quote, nothing to confront. For those inside the room, the experience was disorienting. The rules were clear but unspoken. Everyone understood what behavior invited scrutiny, but no one articulated why. This ambiguity strengthened Margaret's position. Without clear boundaries, people erred on the side of caution. They avoided not only mistakes, but initiative. The room became predictable, orderly, and constrained. Evan Brooks and Malik Turner observed this dynamic without emotional attachment. They were not invested in the room's approval. They did not measure their worth through its standards. This distance allowed them to see the pattern more clearly. They noticed how humiliation followed a consistent sequence: attention, exposure, silence. The repetition stood out. It suggested intention rather than spontaneity. What changed this time was not Margaret's behavior, but the room's response. The humiliation landed, but it did not dissipate as expected. The silence that followed felt heavier, less cooperative. The usual signals of alignment were delayed. Postures adjusted more slowly. The room hesitated. It was a subtle shift, but one that disrupted the rhythm Margaret relied on. Emotional discomfort reached a threshold. The accumulated weight of repeated humiliation altered the atmosphere. People did not suddenly resist, but they became aware. Awareness did not express itself through action. It expressed itself through stillness. The room stopped absorbing the moment automatically. That pause, however brief, was significant. Margaret sensed the difference instinctively. Control depended on immediacy. When reactions slowed, authority weakened. The humiliation had been delivered as always, but its effect had changed. It no longer reinforced certainty. It introduced doubt. Not about the individual targeted, but about the method itself. The room's silence, once a shield for Margaret's dominance, became ambiguous. Silence could no longer be assumed as agreement. It might indicate restraint, calculation, or observation. This uncertainty unsettled the structure. A system built on predictable responses faltered when those responses varied. Evan and Malik did not intervene. They did not need to. Their role was not to disrupt, but to remain present. Their continued observation altered the dynamic simply by existing outside it. The room, accustomed to internal compliance, was unprepared for external awareness. This time, the humiliation landed differently. The shift began as something so small it could have been mistaken for fatigue. Margaret Hale delivered her control the way she always did, with precision that made it hard to challenge without looking unreasonable. The room had seen this pattern before and usually responded on instinct. Attention tightened, body stilled, and whatever discomfort appeared was quickly swallowed by the need to move on. This time, however, the moment did not dissolve. It lingered. Evan Brooks and Malik Turner noticed the difference immediately, not because they were unusually brave or gifted, but because they had lived in environments where patterns mattered. When things repeat, you learn to feel when the repetition breaks. The room's rhythm had always been smooth after Margaret asserted herself. People recovered quickly. Their faces reset. Their posture returned to neutral. The meeting continued, and the humiliation became just another quiet bruise no one acknowledged. That recovery was absent now. The air did not clear. The humiliation created tension, not submission. Instead of the usual quick recalibration, a slow heaviness entered the room like a low-pressure system that refused to lift. The silence after Margaret's moment of dominance was the kind of silence that made people aware they were silent. It wasn't cooperative. It wasn't smooth. It didn't feel like agreement. It felt like a pause that had been forced into existence by something no one wanted to name. Small reactions rippled outward in ways most people ignored, because they were trained to ignore them. A chair shifted too late. A hand that would normally move to take notes stayed still. A glance that would normally drop out of respect held for an extra second and then looked away as if caught. The room was full of people who had mastered subtlety for survival, and even their subtlety was beginning to misfire. It wasn't resistance yet. It was hesitation, and hesitation was new. Evan and Malik did not focus on Margaret first. They focused on the room. The room was the organism, and Margaret was the force it had been trained to obey. The boys watched how the organism responded when the force pushed. They noticed how tension traveled, how it settled in shoulders and throats, how it changed the speed at which people breathed. They recognized what the adults inside the room could not afford to recognize: The silence was no longer doing its job. Awareness replaced compliance in increments. It did not arrive as a unified decision. It arrived in fragments. Someone stopped nodding automatically. Someone stopped smiling to soften the moment. Someone who would normally rush to reframe the humiliation as productive did not rush this time. No one announced anything. Nothing was said. Yet the collective posture shifted from absorbing to assessing. People began to watch Margaret's behavior rather than simply accept it. This was the discovery moment for Evan and Malik, not because they uncovered a secret about Margaret, but because they saw the room reveal a secret about itself. The room had always functioned as if it had no choice. Now, even briefly, it behaved as if choice existed. The boys recognized that obedience was not inevitable. It was maintained. It depended on everyone playing their role perfectly. When one role faltered, the entire structure became visible. The silence grew heavier as the room's internal logic changed. Heavy silence is not empty. It is crowded with unsaid calculations. People weighed risks in real time. They measured how much they could show without being punished for it. They sensed that something was different, but no one wanted to be the first to confirm it. The room hovered at the edge of a new truth, that Margaret's power required their participation more than her confidence. Evan and Malik remained outwardly neutral. Their faces did not signal judgment. Their bodies did not react. They did not exchange obvious looks. They did not do anything that would make them noticeable. Their discipline came from experience. In their world, attention was valuable. If you wanted to keep seeing, you had to remain uninteresting. They let the room expose itself while they blended into the background of it. What they noticed next was more unsettling. The people most invested in Margaret's approval did not recover the atmosphere the way they usually did. The room's informal guardians, those who typically smoothed tension, redirected energy, and turned humiliation into a lesson, seemed unsure of how to proceed. They were accustomed to repairing damage quickly because repair kept the system stable. Now they hesitated, and their hesitation confirmed that the system was wobbling. This wobble did not make anyone feel safe. It made them feel unmoored. When a system built on fear starts to slip, people don't immediately become courageous. They become watchful. They become careful. The absence of certainty creates its own anxiety. Evan and Malik understood this instinctively. They had seen similar dynamics in smaller forms when a neighborhood rule stopped being enforced, when a routine changed, when the usual consequences didn't arrive. Uncertainty always changed behavior before it changed outcomes. The room began to feel like it was listening to itself. That was the most dangerous shift of all. A room that notices its own silence becomes capable of questioning why it is silent. Evan and Malik watched the subtle discomfort that comes with self-awareness. People were no longer just enduring the moment. They were experiencing themselves enduring it, and that self-recognition altered the room's atmosphere. It was as if everyone could suddenly see the cost of their own stillness. Margaret, for her part, remained composed. She did not show strain openly, but control is sensitive to timing, and timing had begun to fail. The usual immediate reset did not arrive. The quiet after her dominance stretched longer than she intended. The room did not return to her pace. It held its breath, and for the first time, that breath felt like it belonged to the room, not to her. Evan and Malik recognized that they were witnessing a threshold. The room was not revolting. It was not even protesting. It was doing something more subtle and more consequential. It was hesitating together without coordination. That kind of collective hesitation could not be purchased or ordered. It emerged when fear stopped working as smoothly as it once did. Margaret sensed the room slipping, slightly but unmistakably. Margaret Hale did not change her behavior when the room shifted. She relied on consistency the way others relied on reassurance. Authority, in her experience, was maintained by repetition. If a method had worked before, it would work again. The room had always responded predictably. Attention tightened, silence followed, and order resumed. There was no reason in her mind to adjust. She proceeded as she always had. Her posture remained composed. Her timing remained precise. The signals she used to assert dominance were delivered with the same restraint and confidence that had defined her presence for years. To an outside observer, nothing appeared different. Margaret was still in control. The structure of the room remained intact. The mechanisms of authority were activated as expected. But the room no longer absorbed her behavior the same way. The familiar sequence stalled. Silence arrived, but it lacked cohesion. It did not settle. It lingered, uncertain. People did not shift as quickly. The usual alignment felt delayed, almost reluctant. The difference was subtle enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to be felt. Margaret noticed it not as defiance, but as friction. Evan Brooks and Malik Turner did nothing outwardly. They did not react, did not exchange glances, did not alter their posture. Their stillness blended into the room's existing tension. Yet internally, everything had changed. Their understanding of the dynamic had sharpened. They recognized that authority depended not only on action but on reception. Control required participation. Silence, when no longer automatic, revealed its fragility. The boys continued to observe with intention. They noticed how people processed the moment, how discomfort moved through the room without resolution. They sensed hesitation where certainty once existed. This hesitation did not announce itself. It revealed itself through micro-adjustments, through the way attention failed to converge as it once had. The room was no longer synchronized. This desynchronization destabilized the power dynamic. Margaret's authority had always functioned through immediacy. Actions produced reactions. Reactions reinforced hierarchy. When that chain slowed, authority lost momentum. The room still complied, but compliance felt conditional. It was no longer reflexive. That distinction mattered. Margaret responded instinctively by applying pressure through familiarity. She relied on the assumption that repetition would restore equilibrium. Yet each repetition exposed the shift further. The room's responses varied slightly each time, creating inconsistency where uniformity had once existed. Control built on predictability struggled in the presence of variation. The boys' role in this moment was passive yet decisive. Their awareness introduced an external perspective the room was not designed to accommodate. They were not bound by its internal incentives. They did not fear reputational cost. They did not seek approval. Their presence existed outside the room's economy of compliance. This independence altered the atmosphere simply by existing within it. The power dynamic began to reveal its dependence on silence as agreement. When silence became ambiguous, authority lost clarity. Margaret could no longer assume alignment. She had to interpret reactions rather than rely on them. Interpretation required attention, and attention exposed vulnerability. The room sensed this shift intuitively. People became aware of their own silence. What had once been automatic now required decision. That awareness introduced discomfort, but also agency. Individuals recognized that their stillness carried meaning. Silence was no longer a neutral state, it was a choice. This realization disrupted the room's equilibrium. Margaret felt the change as resistance without opposition. No one challenged her. No one contradicted her. Yet the certainty she relied on no longer returned. Authority that must be reassured has already weakened. She sensed that something in the room had slipped beyond her control, though she could not identify its source. The first visible crack in dominance appeared not through confrontation, but through delay. Moments stretched longer than expected. Responses arrived incomplete. The room hesitated collectively without coordination. This hesitation undermined the efficiency Margaret prized. Control, once seamless, now required reinforcement. Evan and Malik recognized this moment as significant. They understood that systems often falter not when attacked, but when observed without participation. Their continued presence, unreactive and attentive, prevented the room from returning to its prior state. Awareness had altered the conditions under which authority operated. Margaret attempted to recalibrate by narrowing her focus. She paid closer attention to reactions, to posture, to timing. Yet this vigilance only heightened the sense of exposure. Authority that watches itself loses its illusion of inevitability. The room sensed her attention shifting, and that awareness further destabilized the dynamic. For the first time, Margaret felt watched instead of obeyed. The room did not change in a single dramatic moment. It changed the way weather changes, when an invisible pressure system crosses a line and everything feels different before anyone can explain why. People did not stand up, protest, or confront Margaret Hale directly. They simply stopped cooperating with the atmosphere she had trained them to maintain. The obedience that once felt automatic began to feel deliberate, and once obedience becomes deliberate, it can also become conditional. Collective awareness replaced individual fear in small, connected increments. One person's hesitation gave another person permission to pause. A delayed nod made the next nod less certain. The room had spent years teaching itself to recover quickly after humiliation, to smooth tension so leadership could continue uninterrupted. Now the recovery failed. Instead of racing to restore comfort, people began to notice discomfort. That noticing spread, quietly and efficiently, like a thought everyone had been avoiding but suddenly could not unthink. The energy shifted without confrontation because the shift was internal. The room began to hold its own reactions rather than surrender them to Margaret's timing. Silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of agreement. It became the silence of assessment. The air felt heavier, not because anyone was angry, but because people were present in a way they had not been before. They were no longer simply enduring the moment, they were registering it, weighing it, remembering it. Margaret's influence weakened in the precise place it had always been strongest, the room's reflex to obey. She could still speak with authority. She could still direct attention. She could still impose pressure through tone and timing. But the immediate emotional surrender she relied on no longer arrived. Her dominance was still visible, yet its effect was dulled by the room's emerging awareness. Power that once moved through people like a current now met resistance in the form of stillness. This resistance was not organized. That was what made it difficult to punish. Margaret had built her control around targeting individuals. She could isolate one person, expose one weakness, and use the room's silence to confirm hierarchy. Now the room's behavior was diffuse. No single person was responsible for the shift. It existed in the collective, in the shared hesitation that made her usual tactics less effective. There was no clear target, and without a target, her methods lost precision. Evan Brooks and Malik Turner remained unnamed and largely unseen, yet their presence mattered. They did not lead the shift through action. They amplified it through observation. Their stillness signaled something the room had forgotten: that authority can be watched. Not challenged, not attacked, just watched without submission. That kind of attention alters the atmosphere. It removes the illusion that power is natural and replaces it with the awareness that power is performed. The boys' impact was quiet but undeniable. They offered no speeches, no declarations, no visible defiance. They simply carried themselves as if the room's rules were not sacred. That posture, subtle and almost accidental, destabilized the social contract everyone else had been honoring. It reminded the room that the cost of obedience was real, and that the cost had been paid so often it had become invisible. Once that cost became visible, people could no longer pretend it didn't exist. The emotional payoff was bittersweet because nothing about the shift felt celebratory. The room did not become kind. It did not suddenly transform into a space of fairness. It simply became awake. Awareness is not comfort. It is clarity, and clarity often arrives with discomfort attached. People realized they had been participating in a system that diminished them, and that realization carried shame as well as relief. It was easier to endure humiliation when it felt inevitable. It was harder once it felt chosen. Margaret felt the change as a narrowing of options. She could continue as she always had, but the room would no longer absorb it as cleanly. She could escalate, but escalation risked revealing what she always tried to conceal: that her control required cooperation. The more she pressed, the more visible the structure became. Her influence had not vanished, but it no longer felt absolute. The room had found a thin line where authority could be resisted without confrontation, and once that line exists, it cannot be erased. For Evan and Malik, the moment carried its own quiet weight. They did not receive credit. They did not receive protection. They were not celebrated. Their role was not to win. It was to witness a shift and survive it. They understood instinctively that changing a room is not the same as changing a world. Still, they had seen something rare: a collective pause that exposed the mechanics of dominance. That knowledge would stay with them. The room moved forward, but it did not return to its previous state. Even if people tried to perform normalcy again, they would be performing with memory. Margaret's authority could still command attention, but it could no longer command innocence. The room had learned to hesitate together, and that hesitation was a permanent crack in the old structure. But changing the room did not mean changing the system. Some stories aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to reveal how power actually behaves when no one challenges it. If this moment stayed with you, let it move beyond this screen. That's how stories like this continue to matter. If a room can change without a single word being spoken, how many times do you think you felt that shift and chose to ignore it?